Welcome back and thanks for being here for another one of my true crime videos. If you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to this channel and hit the bell for notifications so that you'll be updated every time I post a new deep dive. Today's case involves another tragic death of a child, and the details are pretty hard to cope with. Even as I was compiling my notes for this video, I had to take breaks because it was just so hard to get through, and I just want to give you guys that warning before we continue. Today we're talking about Noah Cuatro, a 4-year-old little boy from Los Angeles County, California, who was murdered in 2019. Unbelievably, this case involves the death of another little boy whose life was cut short by his own sadistic, abusive parents. Noah's case was featured at the end of the Netflix documentary series, The Trials of Gabriel Fernandez, because Noah met a nearly identical fate to Gabriel just 6 years later in the same county. How did LA County DCFS and the juvenile court systems fail Noah and Gabriel in such a short amount of time? It's terrible to think that not one but 2 little boys could be abused and murdered by their own parents in the same county, but the thing is, they're not the only ones. In California alone, it's estimated that around 150 children who've had contact with DCFS still died under conditions of abuse or neglect since 2013. And that number is far greater than it should be. Social workers around the world don't have enough training or resources at their disposal. They deal with tens of thousands of families at a time, and they just don't have enough employees. And the employees that they do have are overworked and they're underpaid, and many bureaucratic protocols and hierarchies prevent them from taking action that could save a child's life. Noah Cuatro came so close to escaping his tormentors. But this story doesn't have a happy ending. It doesn't even have a happy beginning or middle. So without any further delay, let's dive deep into today's case. Noah Cuatro was born on August 20th, 2014. But LA County DCFS had their eyes on his family before he ever took his first breath. Noah's biological parents, Ursula Juarez and Jose Cuatro, had a long history with social services. The two met in high school, and from the beginning, this was a match made in hell. They certainly didn't have the mature relationship that you would hope parents would have. Instead, they were utterly dysfunctional and unable to regulate their own emotions, let alone care for their children. Ursula had her and Jose's first child, a girl, when she was 18, and when she was 20, she had Noah. When she was 23, she had another child, and I think she would go on to give birth a few more times. There are at least 2 more pregnancies that we know of. But by the time Noah was born, LA County DCFS already had an open investigation into abuse allegations against his mother. Ursula had been accused of abusing her infant daughter, resulting in a skull fracture. Now, skull fractures on an infant or a toddler, someone that young, point to abuse or neglect, specifically shaken baby syndrome. And shaken baby syndrome is exactly what it sounds like. Some new parents experience a lot of frustration and agitation when they're caring for their newborn, and because they don't know how to cope with that stress, they resort to shaking their baby, and this is really bad. You do not ever shake a baby because they're so fragile, and extensive injuries can result because of it. Not only can they have bruising on their skin because of it, but they can also receive bruising to their brain. They can receive spinal cord injuries, skull fractures, just like in the case of Ursula's infant daughter. So it's really troubling to think that Ursula could have hurt her daughter so violently that it resulted in a skull fracture. Obviously, that type of injury takes a lot of force, a lot of impact, and it's not something that a baby is capable of doing to themselves. So these injuries weren't just the result of an accident. They were a result of abuse, at the very least, terrible, dangerous neglect. Luckily, the LA County DCFS social worker that was on the Cuatro's case at this time wasn't going to let Ursula have the opportunity to harm another child. She issued a full investigation into the abuse claims, and knowing that Ursula was pregnant, she arranged to have Noah taken away from her as soon as he was born. So it's no surprise that Noah's birth wasn't the happy celebration that it should have been. There weren't photos or flowers. Noah didn't receive the welcome into this world that he deserved. LA County DCFS took him out of his parents' custody as soon as he was born, and he spent the first few weeks of his life bouncing around from foster home to foster home. Because of this, Noah wasn't able to form that essential bond that newborns have with his mother, and it would later become obvious that Ursula failed to develop any maternal feelings for Noah. Now, it's totally possible to develop a nurturing bond and unconditional love for a child that is not biologically your own. This happens with adoptive parents all the time, but I don't think Ursula was a very good parent to begin with. She was already accused of harming one of her children. There's a very good possibility that she would have hurt Noah, whether or not she had that bonding time with him when he was born. So it's just strikes me as really sad for Noah, because he didn't have that sense of stability as a newborn, and I don't know much about his stays with the various foster homes in those first few weeks, but I really hope that he was nurtured and well cared for. So after a few weeks of bouncing around in the foster care system, Noah was placed with a family member. He was put in the temporary custody of his great-grandmother, Eva Hernandez. And as far as I can tell, she was a capable, responsible, and loving caregiver. As Noah's temporary guardian, she was getting him to all of his doctor's appointments. She made sure he was clean and well fed, that he had plenty of age-appropriate toys and enriching activities and interaction throughout the day. And Noah seemed to do really well with Eva. He seemed to thrive. And he would stay with her for 9 months. But when DCFS couldn't gather concrete proof that Ursula was responsible for her daughter's skull fracture, the investigation was determined to be inconclusive, and Noah was returned to his parents. Eva Hernandez expressed concerns about the reunification between baby Noah and his parents. She didn't feel like they were ready. But her concerns didn't seem to count for much, and Noah was still placed back with his parents. But it wouldn't be long before the Cuatro family was back on the DCFS radar. In November of 2016, when Noah was just a little over 2 years old, the hospital that he should have been receiving his doctor's appointments at called LA County DCFS to let them know that Ursula and Jose had failed to bring Noah in for his last 8 doctor's appointments. They had missed 8 appointments in the course of just 6 months. Because of Noah's young age and his history with DCFS, it was really important that his parents brought him to these doctor's appointments. Babies and toddlers need to reach a lot of developmental milestones, and the doctor's appointments that occur in the first few years of life are extremely important because that growth and development needs to be monitored. And if Noah's not showing up for these doctor's appointments, there's no way for professionals to monitor his health or to make sure that he is where he needs to be developmentally. So once again, LA County social workers were on the scene. They showed up at the Cuatro residence to investigate, and what they found was a deteriorating Noah. He was so weak and malnourished that he couldn't even walk. At 2 years old, he weighed just 17 pounds, and the average weight for a 2-year-old boy should be between 27 and 30, so he was definitely malnourished and nowhere where he needed to be health-wise or developmentally, and doctors would have known this if they had seen him at those checkups. But this is exactly why Ursula and Jose never brought him to those checkups. They knew what they were doing was wrong. They knew if anyone saw the condition that Noah was in, they'd be in big trouble. So they tried their best to hide it. When the caseworker who was on this visit asked the Cuatros why Noah was so deteriorated and sick looking, they actually blamed it on Noah, and we saw this with the Adrian Jones case as well. Ursula and Jose told the social workers that Noah, 2-year-old Noah, who was 17 pounds, was a troublemaker and they couldn't control him. He would just go wild and eat everything in the house and just stuff himself, basically to the point that he would gorge himself and vomit up everything he ate. So he was just constantly doing this and vomiting up his food, so he never got any nutrients, so that's why he looked so skinny. This was their excuse. And this is just absolutely unbelievable because, first of all, I doubt that Ursula and Jose, 2 grown people, couldn't control their 17-pound 2-year-old. That's the first part that's ridiculous. The second part is just, even if you are to throw up like 20 minutes after eating a big meal, you would still retain nearly half of the calories that you ingested. Even if it seems like you regurgitated most of what you ate, it's just not possible for him to be that deteriorated so quickly, because he was in fine condition when he went from Eva Hernandez's care to the Cuatros. It was only when he was in the Cuatros' care that he started to deteriorate like that. So Noah wasn't weak and malnourished because he was gorging himself or purging. He was weak and malnourished because his parents were starving him. So once again, at the age of just 2 years old, Noah is removed from his parents' custody for a second time. This time, instead of going into the foster system, he was put in a treatment center for medically fragile children called the Bithia House. Here, the goal was to restore Noah to health, and that's exactly what happened. And miraculously, the stomach issues with the gorging and purging, the stuff that Ursula and Jose talked about, none of that was ever a problem at Bithia House, and Noah started gaining weight as soon as he got there. After Noah's 2016 stay at Bithia House, he was returned to the care of his great-grandmother, Eva Hernandez. And during this time, the 2 lit up each other's lives. Noah was walking, talking, and singing. He loved to sing Old MacDonald Had a Farm. He brought a lot of joy into Eva's life, and he started to develop his own little personality. He loved cuddles, and he would hug his great-grandmother and say, "You know what time it is, Grandma? It's time for you to hold me and tell me you love me," which is so precious and just, I think, goes to show how much he needed love and comfort. Even though Eva once again had temporary custody of Noah, his parents were allowed to have visitations. They were allowed to take him for a few hours at a time, but Eva's heart would break every time she had to see Noah off for one of these visitations. He would cry for up to 45 minutes before and after each visit, and he would say that he didn't want to go with them. When they returned him, he would be visibly upset, and it never seemed like he enjoyed the time he spent with them. It didn't really even seem like Ursula and Jose were that enthusiastic about being with Noah. They would take him on visitations sometimes, but other times they just wouldn't show up, and they didn't always make him a priority. Still, when it came to the court system and the DCFS investigation against them, the Cuatros made it seem like they really wanted Noah back, and they were fighting to get him back. In 2017, the DCFS investigation that had Noah removed for the second time had lasted like a year and a half. And eventually the juvenile court system decided to start a reunification plan for the Cuatro family. Once again, they started the process to return Noah to his parents. But Ursula and Jose were given stipulations for this reunification. They needed to enroll Noah in daycare and in therapy. They needed to get him medical attention and start showing up to doctor's appointments. And they needed to complete a parenting program with a focus on parent-child bonding. All of this would be arranged for them with the help of DCFS, and they would have a specific social worker to help them oversee the reunification process. Since Eva no longer had legal custody, all she could do was stand by her great-grandson and try to advocate for him. There was a lot of new social workers coming in and out of the picture at this time, and so she made it her duty to really update them and make sure they were all informed about what was going on with Noah. Eventually, LA County DCFS social worker Susan Johnson was put on Noah's case, and she would fight harder for this little boy than anyone ever had or would. Susan Johnson's job as a continuing services child social worker required her to oversee the reunification of the Cuatro family and report back to the courts. Her colleagues had warned her that Ursula and Jose were manipulators and proven liars, on top of being accused child abusers. So Susan Johnson made it a point to read through all of Noah's case files. She updated herself on what she was walking into, and she made sure to listen to what Noah had to say. She also made it a point to listen to the concerns of Eva Hernandez, who at this point felt pretty dismissed by the system. Susan Johnson made a number of visits to the Cuatro family home where she was able to make contact with Noah. And in the reports from these visits, she expressed a lot of concern for Noah. He seemed to exhibit a lot of telltale signs of abuse and neglect. She noticed this in some of the other children as well, but no one really seemed to be as bad off as Noah. He seemed to be treated worse, and therefore he acted differently. And Susan Johnson picked up on this. She was worried that Noah was being used as the scapegoat in the Cuatro family dynamic. According to family systems theories, some families will adopt the method of a scapegoat to cope with their dysfunction. Dysfunctional families, whether it's conscious or subconscious, will sometimes choose one member of the family to inherit all of the blame for their problems. So basically, everything wrong with the family, all the dysfunction, is attributed to one person, one scapegoat. And this scapegoat is often subject to lesser treatment. Even when things aren't their fault, they're blamed for it. In really extreme cases, the scapegoat of the family can be severely abused and neglected. By putting all of those problems and that blame on the scapegoat, the rest of the family can carry on under the illusion that they're not responsible for the dysfunction. It's basically a coping mechanism, and this sounds pretty spot on for what Noah was going through. Ursula and Jose definitely targeted him more than the other children, and we saw this same kind of behavior with Gabriel Fernandez and Adrian Jones. Months into the reunification plan, Ursula and Jose had failed to enroll Noah in therapy or in daycare. They never completed the parenting classes they were supposed to take. They basically ignored everything the court was requiring them to do for reunification. Luckily, Susan Johnson was intelligent and observant, and she cared about Noah. It was her job to oversee the reunification of this family. Noah was never placed in therapy or daycare, and he was telling family members and social workers that he didn't want to be with them. Still, the LA County juvenile courts didn't listen to this little boy whose life was in their hands. And they didn't listen to Susan Johnson, whose job it was to investigate these claims and report back to them. Despite Ursula and Jose's unwillingness to cooperate, the courts decided to just keep moving forward with the reunification plan. It wasn't working and they were getting nowhere with it, but they just kept going. There was no intervention. When parents refuse to cooperate or they disregard the authority of the court, that calls for intervention. Things aren't going to get better unless there's consequences, unless those types of behaviors are addressed. Right now, Ursula and Jose weren't facing any consequences for not cooperating. Even though this reunification wasn't seeing much progress, Susan Johnson was still on the case, and she would record and report all of her interactions with the Cuatro family. She told the court systems that the Cuatros had lied to her multiple times throughout the last few years. Ursula and Jose continually lied about obtaining medical insurance, and they still weren't getting Noah the medical attention that he needed. Twice, Ursula even lied about being pregnant. She denied 2 pregnancies only to give birth both times. After one birth, Ursula allegedly tried to sneak out of the hospital with her baby because she knew that LA County DCFS was going to be called and they were going to open a new investigation. And lying about your pregnancies to cover up your bad parenting, that's so indicative of who Ursula is, and I think it shows a lot about how she felt about her kids. She didn't value her children or view them as blessings, and she hid these pregnancies so that she wouldn't have to answer to child welfare services. She knew she was a crummy parent with 2 strikes against her, and she knew what she was doing was wrong, so she tried to hide it. There would be times when Susan Johnson would attempt to make unannounced home visits to the Cuatro family. This was just a part of her job. She wanted to be able to see them in their natural element. You know, if a family knows that a social worker is going to come and pay them a visit, they might get their act together a little bit. But if they show up unannounced, it's more likely that the social worker will be able to observe how they act naturally, how they normally are, rather than this staged, coached performance, right? So Susan Johnson would try to make unannounced home visits for the Cuatro family, but most of the time they just wouldn't answer the door. And they would use excuses later on and say that they were just out of the house whenever Susan came by on these unannounced visits. But she thinks, and I honestly think so too, that there were probably times when the Cuatro family was home and Susan Johnson came knocking and they just didn't answer the door. And that technique would pretty much be effective to bar her from entering or from even, laying eyes on Noah. And this is a huge problem for social workers everywhere. Without a warrant, it's pretty much impossible to get parents to cooperate with you or let you into their house if they don't want to. Remember in the Adrian Jones case? All his parents had to do is keep moving around and changing their address to avoid social services. Unfortunately, when parents don't want to comply, they come up with plenty of ways to avoid social services. On some of the times when Susan Johnson was able to make contact with Noah, she saw him bruised and beaten. The Cuatro family moved around a lot, but their residences never seemed really kid-friendly. There wasn't a lot of toys, and Noah and his siblings didn't have their own beds. By the spring of 2019, when Noah was 4 years old, his life hadn't gotten any better. He was no closer to a normal childhood, and the few advocates he had looking out for him seemed to be meeting constant obstacles. In March of 2019, Susan Johnson showed up at the address the Cuatros were claiming to live at, only to find that they didn't live there at all. They had provided DCFS with a fake address. Susan Johnson had to track down the Cuatros' family members to question them in order to find out where they were. And in doing so, she learned that many of their family members were really worried about Noah. They were worried about all of the kids, but Noah was the one of particular concern. Susan recorded this incident and reported it as more proof that Ursula and Jose were liars. Around this time in March of 2019, one of Noah's aunts called an abuse hotline to report a troubling conversation that she'd had with Noah. In this conversation, Noah told her some things that led her to believe that he was definitely being physically abused, but that he could have also been sexually abused. So of course, she called this in, hoping that a report would instigate some action, some type of intervention to help him. In the report, she said that it wasn't just this conversation that made her think that he was experiencing sexual abuse, but it was also a change in his entire personality. His demeanor was different. He was no longer this bubbly boy. He was sad and afraid. And of course, this hotline report from Noah's aunt fell into the lap of his caseworker, Susan Johnson. When Susan Johnson read this, she immediately paid a visit to the Cuatro home to investigate. And what she found on this particular visit was the last straw for her. Noah's arms and neck were covered in bruises, and his back was completely lathered in some thick white cream. Ursula tried to say that the bruising on his neck and upper arms was just because Noah was clumsy, and she said that the cream on his back was for eczema. If it was really that bad, I would have assumed that she would have a doctor's note for it. But of course, this family wouldn't have a doctor's note because they don't take their kids to the doctor. Ursula and Jose always had an excuse for the marks on Noah's body. But Susan Johnson knew better, and she demanded that she speak to Noah alone. And at this point, Noah's 4 years old, so he can pretty much speak for himself. When they were alone together, unprompted, Noah said the words, "I get hit." As soon as the words left his lips, his eyes grew wide like he knew that he said something he shouldn't have. He immediately recanted and said, "I don't get hit." But Susan Johnson, like I said, she's smart. She picks up on these things. She knows what abuse and coaching looks like. This entire visit and the interaction with Noah and his parents raised all the red flags for Susan, and she brought all of this information to her superiors out of concern for Noah. She told them about his extensive bruising and the weird cream on his back, and she also told him that he seemed like very obviously coached, most likely coached by his parents, to cover up abuse. She told her superiors and the juvenile courts about Noah's confession and how he recanted right away, but she urged them to listen to his first declaration. After all, Noah did show signs of physical abuse. His parents had been given countless opportunities to give him medical attention, to enroll him in school and therapy, all of these things which they had a court order to do, and time again they failed. They weren't doing anything to help Noah, and his condition was only getting worse. Susan Johnson tried so hard to advocate for him, and she argued that Noah needed to be taken away from his parents for a third time. But when she brought this up, she was met with the words, "Get a warrant." And now, obviously, Susan Johnson is a continuing services child social worker. She's not a judge or a cop, so she can't just easily go get a warrant. It was almost like they were just dismissing her concerns and telling her to deal with it herself. They knew that removing a child for a third time would be a big deal. It would be another big investigation, and I think they just didn't want to do it. So they basically challenged her to get a warrant. All Susan Johnson could do now was file her reports and step aside while CPS investigators came in to conduct an emergency investigation. While they were not going to be removing Noah from his parents' custody, they felt that Susan's findings plus the report of abuse from Noah's aunt did call for an emergency investigation, and I agree with that. So as soon as CPS got involved, they brought in a new caseworker to take the lead on the Cuatros case. This new caseworker was an ERCSW, which stands for Emergency Response Children's Social Worker, and her name was Maggie Vasquez Ducos. And I have a lot of feelings about this woman, and I don't know where to begin. I normally will try to say in cases like these that I don't blame social workers for what's happened. But in this case, I personally think that Maggie Vasquez Ducos owns some of the responsibility for what happened. Susan Johnson did everything she could to help Noah, and as soon as Maggie Vasquez Ducos entered the picture, she started to undo all of Susan's hard work. She may not have had evil intentions, and she may not have laid a hand on Noah the way that his parents did, but her gross misconduct and incompetency led to one of the ultimate failures in Noah's case. And that might sound harsh, but it's my opinion and I'm allowed to have it, so. It was her job to lead this new emergency investigation. She was one of Noah's last lifelines. But she didn't seem to find it important to read any of the previous abuse reports, including the one his aunt made that brought her to the Cuatros in the first place. She never read any of Noah's case files. She actually never read Noah's case file until after he had died. And so even before she ever met the Cuatros, she's failing to do her job right then and there. And when Vasquez Ducos showed up at the Cuatro residence for her first home visit, she found a smiling Ursula. Per usual, Noah was covered in bruises, but Ursula and Jose were ready to get down to business. They were quick to excuse away all of Noah's injuries, saying that he fell off a bunk bed. And Maggie Vasquez Ducos wouldn't put much effort into substantiating this claim. Ursula went on to tell Maggie Vasquez Ducos that her previous social worker, Susan Johnson, and the rest of DCFS were out to get her. She told her that they were targeting her because she was a minority, and that DCFS had already done enough damage by robbing her of her first 9 months with Noah. She told Vasquez Ducos how unfair the whole situation was, and she really laid it on thick. Ursula said, quote, "Why would we hurt our baby when we just got him back? I've had this case open for 2 years and I've been told that I'm good enough to have my 2 kids but not Noah. How does that make sense?" End quote. And apparently this sob story was enough to convince the dangerously naive Maggie Vasquez Ducos. From the beginning, she was recruited to the side of Ursula and Jose. I don't think that Maggie Vasquez Ducos had enough training. She obviously didn't know about family systems theories. She herself admitted to not reading any of Noah's case files. So I don't know how she could confidently take the side of his parents over the child that she is sent in to protect and advocate for. She literally works for Child Protective Services, but she chose to advocate for the rights of parents over the rights of this child. There was so much information at her disposal, literally at her fingertips, that could have helped her form a better, more accurate opinion about the Cuatros, but she just ignored all of that and sided with the parents. I don't understand. Since day one of being put on Noah's case, Maggie Vasquez Ducos was being taken advantage of by Ursula and Jose, and she was just failing to do her job. In this first initial meeting between Noah and Maggie Vasquez Ducos, he denied any claims of sexual abuse. She came to the conclusion that none of the abuse reports could be substantiated, and she filed her investigation as inconclusive. Luckily, while Vasquez Ducos was writing off all of these abuse allegations, Susan Johnson hadn't given up on Noah. She may not have been in charge of his case anymore, but she was still working to get Noah out of his parents' abusive household. Susan Johnson filed a complaint with LA County lawyers, resulting in a petition to remove Noah from his parents' custody for a 3rd time. Rather than sitting back feeling like her hands were tied, she followed through on her superior's challenge to get that warrant. Bringing this petition to remove Noah was her last-ditch attempt to save him. She knew that things were escalating in the Cuatro family. Ursula was about to give birth to another child, and no doubt this stress could make things even worse for Noah. Amazingly, the juvenile courts granted her this order to remove Noah and to have him seen by a medical examiner who would be able to determine if sexual abuse had occurred. Obviously, a medical examination from a doctor, a medical professional, is going to be a lot more conclusive than frickin' Maggie Vasquez Ducos showing up on the scene and just being like, "Oh, you know, everything's fine," and literally taking the side of the people who were committing the abuse. So Susan Johnson's petition to remove Noah was signed by that juvenile court judge in early summer of 2019. But when her superiors heard that she had actually gone ahead and obtained a court warrant to remove him, they called their own emergency meeting. In this meeting, Susan Johnson, Maggie Vasquez Ducos, and DCFS leaders discussed Noah's case and whether or not they were going to follow through on this removal order. And in my opinion, it's like a little too late for this meeting. Susan Johnson came to them first, asking to remove him. Now she has a court order. It's signed by a judge. What are they waiting on? There's really nothing left to discuss at this point. But of course, these bureaucratic protocols put everything to a halt while they all met and talked. Susan Johnson later recalled trying to advocate for Noah in this meeting. She tried to warn everyone that if they didn't act on this court order, they could have a dead kid on their hands. She didn't even know how true that statement was. But even as she was trying to tell them this, one of her superiors actually had the audacity to elbow her, like trying to get her to shut up and stop talking. And I just don't know how, like, you guys, they're in a meeting talking about a court order for a boy who's obviously been abused by his parents before. And they, like, I don't know what their agenda was. It certainly wasn't to save Noah or protect him. And of course, Maggie Vasquez-Ducos is one of the main people who's against Susan Johnson in this meeting, even though Maggie Vasquez-Ducos had never read a single report involving Noah. She had the confidence to testify that she thought he was fine and that Susan Johnson should be taken off his case. I don't know where this woman gets off. She accused Susan Johnson of teaming up with Eva Hernandez to ruin this family and keep them away from Noah. And yes, they were trying to keep him away from Noah, but for good reason. Vasquez-Ducos actually said that she was concerned if DCFS had any more involvement with this family, they would be guilty of discrimination and picking on this family because of cultural differences. And generally, it is very important for police and child welfare agencies to acknowledge and try to understand cross-cultural differences. It takes a lot of patience and tolerance to effectively communicate with people from distinctly different backgrounds. But the thing about the Cuatros is they didn't really come from a distinctly different background. Sure, they were Latino, but Ursula and Jose both were born and raised in the US. English was their first language, and even cross-cultural differences can't explain away years of abuse and neglect reports. Vasquez-Ducos had no idea what she was talking about, yet she blindly vouched for this random family. She had no incentive to support Ursula and Jose. Her job was to protect Noah, but yet she still... At the very least, Maggie Vasquez-Ducos comes off as very naive and easily manipulated, and those are not good qualities for a social worker. So even despite this court order to remove Noah from his parents' custody, no one ever followed through on it. Vasquez-Ducos and her superiors at DCFS and CPS decided that she needed to do more investigation before they could justify such drastic measures as removing Noah for a third time. And yes, maybe removing a 4-year-old from their parents' custody 3 times is drastic, but I think this situation certainly called for it. It's drastic, but it's necessary. It's at this point that Susan Johnson is completely removed from Noah's case. Now, Maggie Vasquez-Ducos and another social worker were fully responsible for the Cuatros case. Even though they had decided not to act on that court order to remove Noah, legally, DCFS had 10 days to act on it. At the very least, they needed to get Noah to a doctor to receive that medical exam. This court order was the equivalent of a warrant, and if they needed law enforcement to help them get Noah, they could use them, but they decided not to. They literally had the power to save Noah, and DCFS refused. So Noah continued to stay with his terrible, abusive parents, and in the summer of 2019, they were living in an apartment in Palmdale, California. Around this time, Maggie Vasquez-Ducos and the other social worker who is now placed on the case paid a visit to the Cuatros' apartment. And here they found Noah with a cut across his face. Ursula and Jose provided 3 different explanations for how Noah received this injury. And the truth only happens one way, so they're most likely lying, probably to cover up abuse. In the reports from this 2019 visit, both social workers said that Noah came running up to them a number of times to announce things like, "They give me lots of food and they take good care of me." Obvious signs that Noah had been coached, probably to cover up his parents' wrongdoing. They knew that withholding food and not feeding him enough had caused issues before, so Ursula and Jose no doubt coached Noah to inform these social workers that he got plenty of food even when he didn't. The same way they probably coached him to say he wasn't hit when he was. Social workers are supposed to be trained to pick up on this, so I don't know why they didn't. They are literally paying a visit to investigate abuse claims. This kid is showing physical signs of abuse and signs of coaching, and they still didn't act on the court order. They had to remove him then and there. Maggie Vasquez Ducos took her findings from this visit and reported them to the juvenile court, requesting that she had more time to investigate the Cuatros case. Remember, they had 10 days to follow through on this court removal order? Well, now Maggie Vasquez Ducos was granted 30 more days to investigate. But whether they had 10 days or 30, they never followed through on this order to remove Noah from his parents. Noah was never seen by a doctor for that medical examination, and he never saw his great-grandmother Eva Hernandez again, because Noah never saw his 5th birthday. Vasquez Ducos may have gotten an extension on her investigation, but by this time, days and weeks were passing, and now her coworkers were pressuring her to at least follow through on that medical examination for Noah. But to no surprise, Vasquez Ducos fought this. She did nothing to make that medical examination happen. She even emailed her superiors saying that even though it was court-ordered, Noah's case didn't call for a sexual medical examination because there were no reports of sexual abuse. But this is not true. If she had just read his case file, she would know that many people were worried that he was being sexually abused. I just can't believe this woman that like over and over again, she just made these confident claims when she had no idea what she was talking about. It drives me crazy, I'm sorry. But by July of 2019, I think Maggie Vasquez Ducos was finally beginning to regret her decision to vouch for the Cuatro family. Almost immediately after Maggie was granted an extension in her investigation, the Cuatro family flipped on her. Ursula no longer needed her to do her bidding, so she didn't rely on her to be her confidant or her shoulder to cry on. She wasn't crying to Maggie Vasquez Ducos about how unfair CPS was. In fact, she wasn't talking to Maggie Vasquez Ducos at all. Anytime Vasquez Ducos tried to show up at the Cuatro house, they prevented her from entering. She had no way of checking on Noah, who just months before was showing signs of serious physical and sexual abuse. Even when Ursula and Jose were threatening Vasquez Ducos, she still made excuses for them. She said that they were just overwhelmed and that they wanted to be done with the system. They didn't want to have any more interaction with them. But guess what? Just because parents don't want to be involved with DCFS doesn't mean that they're going to get their way. The safety of the child is the most important, and this is what I mean, how Vasquez Ducos valued the wishes and the rights of the parents over the safety of Noah. And it's on July 5th, 2019, a call came in to 911 from the Palmdale apartment complex where the Cuatro family lived. It was Ursula and Jose pleading for help for their 4-year-old son, Noah. Ursula told the 911 operator that they needed emergency services for Noah, who had been found unresponsive in the apartment complex pool. They told the police that Noah had been swimming in the pool and that he drowned as a result of a terrible accident. They said they tried to revive him but were unsuccessful, and therefore they needed an ambulance right away. But when the paramedics arrived on the scene, the Cuatro story just didn't add up. Noah was fully clothed and he was completely dry. It didn't seem like they had just pulled this little boy out of a pool. Noah was taken to a hospital, but he was pronounced dead that day. Noah's body revealed clues that were inconsistent with an accidental drowning, and the medical examiner would later find that he didn't have any water in his lungs. Instead, bruising and molting around Noah's neck revealed his cause of death to be strangulation. His autopsy reported bruising all over his body, and he had multiple broken ribs that were in various stages of healing, pointing to prolonged chronic abuse. The autopsy also revealed undeniable evidence of sexual abuse. Noah was murdered after extensive abuse and torture. His death was ruled a homicide, and police had their eyes on only one pair of suspects. The day after Noah's death, Ursula and Jose were both arrested, and his remaining siblings were put into protective custody. Both Ursula and Jose were charged with child abuse and murder, and their case was brought to a grand jury in 2020. The two of them were indicted on counts of murder and torture, and rightfully so. Jose Cuatro was also slapped with charges of sexual abuse against a minor, resulting in death. Both Ursula and Jose face up to 47 years in prison for these charges. From here, they can negotiate a plea deal or see their cases through criminal trials, but either way, I think these parents are going to be spending most of their life behind bars. Rightfully so. I haven't seen an update on this case since 2020, so I'm not exactly sure what a timeline looks like for final sentencing, but in my opinion, no amount of time in jail will be enough justice for these two monsters. Eva Hernandez filed a civil lawsuit against LA County DCFS. After Noah's death, there was also an internal investigation into DCFS and the CPS agencies that were responsible for his case. Of course, the leaders of these organizations denied any wrongdoing, and they even defended the actions of social workers like Maggie Vasquez Ducos. They admitted to no wrongdoings despite the obvious mishandlings. Obviously, LA County DCFS doesn't want to be liable for the death of a child, but the truth is they failed Noah, and they may not own up to any of that, but I wish they would, because maybe then at least that would restore some faith that they could learn from these mistakes and do better in the future. But obviously, in some situations, they're more concerned with saving face than accepting responsibility or promising change. In the US, child welfare and protective service agencies overemphasize family reunification. They want immediate families to be brought back together, whatever the cost, and sometimes this is to the detriment of the children involved. When CPS organizations overemphasize reunification, they run the risk of valuing the rights of parents over the rights and safety of children. And that's exactly what happened in this case. Even before Noah was born, his parents were suspected of child abuse. When his sister was an infant and she had that skull fracture, DCFS still returned her to the Cuatros, even though it would have been highly unrealistic for her to receive that injury from anything other than abuse or very severe neglect at the least. Even with Noah in particular, when he was 2, his parents starved him. He was half the weight he should have been. He could have died. And yet DCFS somehow felt that they could truthfully claim they had no idea that the Cuatros could be capable of causing his death or even extensive harm. That's bullshit. There was so much proof that they not only could hurt him, but that they had hurt him. Not that they would mistreat him or could mistreat him, but that they were mistreating him. They had ample reason to remove Noah for a third time. Hell, they had a court order. They just ignored it. They refused to do it. And honestly, Noah should have never been returned to his parents in the first place. When it was obvious that they were refusing to comply with the court orders for reunification, the process should have stopped. There needs to be some kind of accountability in that reunification process. If the parents aren't following through on these court orders, what's the point of even issuing them in the first place? This whole case is worse than oversight. It's worse than a terrible accident. To me, it really screams misconduct, like criminal liability. Legally, I might not actually be right, but that's just my opinion. The thing is, though, I hope I don't see anything bad about Susan Johnson, because she really did her best to be there for Noah. She tried so hard to save him and pretty much did everything she could short of breaking down the Cuatros' door and kidnapping Noah. And when I really think about it, that's the only other solution. That's the only thing she probably could have done to save Noah. She did everything else that she could have. If she had broken down the door and saved Noah, sure, she would have maybe been this hero in our eyes, but she also would have been a criminal in the eyes of the law. This poor woman, her hands were tied. She was just trying to do her job. She did as much as she could. She even went above and beyond after she was taken off his case. So I don't want to see anything bad about her. I do think that the other social workers probably should consider going into another field, and yeah, I don't condone any of that, but I think that Susan Johnson really was someone who was fighting for Noah. Whereas LA County DCFS seemed really concerned with politics, too concerned to do what they needed to do to save Noah. After Noah's death, many of his family members expressed extreme remorse and regret for not stepping in when they knew he needed help. In grand jury documents, text messages between Noah's family revealed that they were concerned he would end up dead if CPS didn't immediately intervene. And they didn't, and he did end up dead. LA County DCFS claims that there was no physical evidence to back up the most current claims of abuse. But what about the abnormal amount of bruises on Noah? What about his own declarations of abuse? There was so much evidence, they just chose to ignore it. I mean, what did they need? Hidden camera surveillance footage of the Cuatros actually hitting Noah? Because if that's the standard of evidence required to actually do something, it's going to be really hard to prove any child abuse cases. Noah's physical state, his body language, and the few advocates he had left all painted a clear picture of abuse, torture, and they foreshadowed his gruesome murder. Overall, there is so much more that could have been done to save Noah, and LA County DCFS and everyone around the world can learn something from this case. We can't value parents' rights over the safety of children, and social services in this country needs a complete reform. So as we reach the end of this video, we may not feel a sense of closure or justice in this case, but we can turn that frustration into determination. These kinds of cases cannot keep happening, and the rate at which they do is something that none of us should be comfortable with. We can't settle for our child protective service agencies failing so often and so devastatingly. What can we do about the broken welfare systems in this country? Should a focus on family reunification shift to a focus on individual safety and well-being? Let me know in the comments. Like this video if you support my message. Look out for children, look out for the people around you. If you see something, say something. Don't be afraid to call local abuse hotlines or to contact CPS. We would rather be safe than sorry, especially when it comes to the safety of our children. Thank you for making it through another one of these videos with me. I know Noah's case is particularly terrible. It was hard to get through even filming this video, but it presents so many important issues, things that we need to address to fix the welfare systems in this country. So this is where I'm going to leave you guys. Thank you again for being here. I hope you subscribe to this channel so that I'll see you in my next video.